Today, we're taking a look at our top 48 wide receiver rankings and tiers. We've been updating them since June, and we'll keep doing this again in August before the fantasy drafts. And we're going to talk about how these players have either risen up our ranks, gone down our ranks, where we disagree, and honestly, just some of the best values at the wide receiver position. So let's hop right into tier number one here, Dave, where we are in complete lockstep with our top four wide receivers. At number one, we've got CeeDee Lamb. At two, Tyreek Hill. 3, Jamar Chase. And at 4, Amon-Ra St. Brown. So my question is this, so we don't have to get too much into the analysis of it. These are all very, very good wide receivers. I'm sure we'll talk more about the guys that were left out of this tier. Are these the 4 easiest picks in fantasy football right now outside of Christian McCaffrey? Are these basically the 2, 3, 4, 5 that we're going with in every single fantasy draft?
Yes and no. I think that these guys all deserve to be in the top 7. I think the 2 other players that you can kind of shuffle into this mix are Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson. But I think this is your clear-cut top 7 this year. CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall. I know how I prefer them. You know, I'm going McCaffrey first, then CeeDee, then all the receivers and then the running backs. But if you want to flip it up in like any direction, like I don't really have an issue with it. If you think Breece should be the number 1 guy off the board, go for it. If you think Amon-Ra St. Brown should be the number 1 guy off the board, I don't agree with you, but you can make a strong argument for it. I mean, this is a guy who's shown progression every single year in the league. He still has his quarterback. He's got the big contract now. I know how I prefer the top 7, but I want to push back on anybody if you put any of those 7 guys as your 101 in the draft this year. Also, are we going to just ignore the fact that we're matching today, Alfredo? I'm
we talked about it once on the audio side, so let's all right.
But our YouTube videos, our YouTube viewers are tuning in right now, just wondering what is going on. This was we need to start coordinating this better.
Yeah, it's embarrassing.
Yeah, go to the merch store, footballguys.com. We've got some fantastic merch.
There you go. Good plug. That's how you do that. All right, back to football stuff. I want to say this because it's looking at these wide receivers, and the reason I asked this question is because yesterday, for the sake of just trying it out, I was in a mock draft with a few other industry experts. I'm not an expert. I was just there. But I was at the 105, and off the board went Christian McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase. And I was looking at basically Amon-Ra St. Brown, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall. For the sake of trying it out, I went Bijan Robinson at the 105. I was not a fan of what ensued after that because it really showed me that I want to go wide receiver early in these drafts, even with the upside of Bijan Robinson. The team construction got very, very weird from then on out. I got into the second round, and basically none of the receivers that I really wanted fell to me. And I kind of got stuck in this running back start, which I don't necessarily regret, but it showed me the value of maybe taking an Amon-Ra St. Brown over Bijan Robinson at that point. And it's not necessarily going to be looking as easily as, okay, taking my overall rankings and saying that's how I'm going to draft these guys. Roster construction and league format is going to matter so much. So I get what you're saying. I think I'm going to be leaning Amon-Ra St. Brown at that 5th pick over a guy like Bijan, even with the upside, man, because then I get to the next round and there's actually such good running back value in the second round that if I want those guys, you've got Saquon, you've got Jonathan Taylor, you've got Derrick Henry, you've got Travis Etienne, Kyron Williams, all these guys that fall to the second. But then your wide receivers there, it's not quite the caliber that you can get, obviously earlier. And so I'd want to get one of those top tier guys, like you talked about, is, establishing your roster with a very good wide receiver first.
I also did a mock draft last night, and I kicked the running back can down the curb. My running backs were selected in rounds 5, 7, and 9. And I walked away with Ken Walker, Najee Harris, and Brian Robinson. Like, that's a pretty formidable running back room considering how late I drafted those guys. And then out of my first 4 rounds, I walked out with CeeDee Lamb, Mike Evans, Jaylen Waddle, and T. Higgins. And this is a league with 3 wide receivers and 2 flex spots. So, I mean, that just goes to show right there. Like, if you're looking at, instead of CeeDee Lamb, I could have taken Bijan Robinson. And instead of Mike Evans, I could have taken Devon Achane. But then I'm looking at Jaylen Waddle and T. Higgins as my wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2. At that point, instead of taking the value on guys like Ken Walker, I'm trying to force in guys that I don't really want, like Christian Kirk and Keenan Allen. It just seems like this year, the wide receivers are so top heavy that you want to walk away with those guys in the early round, knowing that you can get good running back value in the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth rounds.
Yeah. Yeah. It almost feels like all the strategy that we've had in past seasons where you said you want to go get an elite running back because there's wide receiver value later. It seems like that has just totally flipped over the years. And now we're seeing it more than ever where you really want to get one of those top 4 or 5 wide receivers, and then running back value, it or excuse me, the wide receiver value after that, it kind of ends up being very similar. And we'll get into that here with our rankings because as we get to the second tier, you'll see that this gets a little bit more nebulous and a little bit more broad. But before we do that, I want to let everyone know we've got a bunch of ways you can enjoy this show here on youtube.com/at Football Guys Fantasy. So if you're watching, please make sure you like this video, subscribe to the show, and leave a comment down below. Let us know what you think about the wide receiver rankings. If you have any questions, we'll answer them in there. And just a reminder, the videos come out the day before the audio podcast does. So you can always access these episodes a day earlier by subscribing to the YouTube channel. It'd be a nice advantage for you in your league. Last thing, we got a listener league giveaway that is exclusive to our YouTube subscribers. We're going to give away one spot to the show's listener league. All you have to do is comment below here on YouTube with the secret phrase, target the targets. All right, there's the secret phrase, target the targets. You guys have been getting creative with these. So being creative certainly helps when we're going to go pick a winner.
And I will also accept any replies saying you guys need to do a better job of coordinating your outfits.
Oof. Yeah. Yeah.
That'll
I mean,
also
I think we're adorable. I think we're adorable. I'm not even upset about it, honestly. All right, tier number 2. Let's hop into this because we have got 4 wide receivers here. And I think this is kind of right before there's a little bit of a cliff that we fall off here for wide receiver. Tier number 2, we have Justin Jefferson at 5, AJ Brown at 6, Puka Nacua at 7, Garrett Wilson at 8. Dave, we did not agree on a single wide receiver in this tier. It was different for each of us. Justin Jefferson was my 5 while he was your 6. AJ Brown was my 6 while he was your 5. Puka was my 7 while he was your 8. And Garrett Wilson was my 8 while he was your 7. So naturally, we just went with whatever my rankings were for this tier because they ended up being about the same. That's how we do it here.
Right.
When I look at this tier, I mean, we've talked enough about Justin Jefferson. If you go back, you talk about you look at one of our episodes where we talked about some of those early round landmines that you want to avoid. We talked about both Justin Jefferson and Puka Nacua and reasons that they could actually be a miss for your fantasy team. Dave, you've got AJ Brown as your wide receiver 5. Knowing that Kellen Moore is going to be the offensive coordinator there in Philly, is there a possibility that we see AJ Brown move a little bit around the field a bit more to get some easier targets, or is he going to probably keep that downfield role that he's had? I think there's a lot of options here for this offense, and I think that's what maybe stops me from moving him to wide receiver 5 because I want to know what they're going to end up doing with DeVonta Smith there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm expecting some more movement and creativity with AJ Brown's usage, the same way that we saw Keenan Allen in like a new role for the first time in his entire career last year. I'm expecting some of that for AJ Brown, but my reason for having AJ Brown ahead of Justin Jefferson is much simpler than that. Like, I don't need to get into like the schematic tendencies of Kellen Moore. It's just that I look at AJ Brown and I look at Justin Jefferson, and talent wise, I put them on a very similar playing field. And of course, like in Dynasty, we're going to prefer Justin Jefferson because he's a little bit younger. But in redraft, like where they're at in their careers, they're 2 of the best wide receivers in the league. And we know what AJ Brown can do with Jalen Hurts. We don't know what Justin Jefferson is going to do with Sam Darnold / JJ McCarthy. So really, it's just as simple as that. We don't know what the floor for Justin Jefferson can look like without Kirk Cousins. We know what the floor and ceiling can look like for AJ Brown with Jalen Hurts. So that's why I prefer Brown ahead of Jefferson. Talent-wise, very similar players. At least we know what we're getting with AJ Brown rather than taking the unknown in Jefferson this year.
Yeah. No, I get that. And even in our last episode that we talked about these guys, like I said, I can be very easily convinced to put AJ Brown ahead of Jefferson. Good offensive coordinators and good offenses use their best players. So not very worried about that. The last guy in this tier that I want to talk about is Garrett Wilson, who I have him at 8. You have him at 7. So naturally, we put him at 8 for the tiers. But we asked this question in the last episode about Breece Hall and the Jets. If Davante Adams is a Jet, because they keep talking about this as if it is a foregone conclusion. We're recording this on Tuesday, July 16th at 12 p.m. Eastern. There has not yet been a trade.
Mhm.
However, the rumors keep flowing. So if Davante Adams becomes a Jet, what does that do to Garrett Wilson? More specifically, how far down your ranks does he fall?
I fear that that would just like nuke Garrett Wilson's value. Like it really, really would. And
Is he out of the top 15?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, he'd probably fall to like the top of the third round for me. Probably somewhere in that like 15 to 18 range. And I hate to say it because like right now, I think what is Garrett Wilson? 22, 23 years old. Like he's still very, very young. And
Mhm.
Davante Adams is going into his age 32 season. Like I think Garrett Wilson at this point in his career is probably a better receiver than Davante Adams is at this point in his career. But Aaron Rodgers is just weird. Like we know that like
We know that he's weird. Yes. We
he
definitely know he's weird.
he prioritizes like chemistry with his receivers over anything else. And that's why he will force feed a guy like Alan Lazard just because he's spent 5 years building a connection with him, and why he'll go out and clamor to bring in Randall Cobb instead of Elijah Moore because he knows Randall Cobb and knows his tendencies and knows where to put the ball where he likes it best. So that would be my fear is like sometimes there is more like, I was just talking about Justin Jefferson and AJ Brown saying they're similar players. Give me AJ Brown because he's in a better situation. I see a pretty big talent disparity where, like, at this point right now, Garrett Wilson is a better receiver than Davante Adams. And in any other situation, I'd probably have Garrett Wilson ahead of Davante Adams. But knowing the Aaron Rodgers impact and the chemistry that he and Adams have together, I fear that Garrett Wilson would just kind of fall by the wayside. And not totally, like he's still a talented player. He's still going to draw targets and make some big plays. But I think that if Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams play a full 17 games together, the targets are absolutely going to Adams more than they're going to Wilson.
Yeah. And so far in his career, everything for Garrett Wilson, despite the talent, I'm not saying he's not talented, but everything has been predicated on volume, regardless of who the quarterback is. Obviously, targets are earned. He's a good player. But I want to do this. Let's play a quick game real quick, Dave, just to go off of your rankings. Davante Adams becomes a Jet. Garrett Wilson or Deebo Samuel, your current wide receiver 15?
Ugh, I think I'm going Deebo there.
Okay, let's just keep going down this list. Garrett Wilson or DJ Moore, your wide receiver 16?
DJ Moore.
All right, next, Garrett Wilson or Michael Pittman, your wide receiver 17?
This is where I draw the line. That's where we put Garrett Wilson right in
Interesting.
between DJ Moore
Okay.
and Michael Pittman for me.
All right, that's interesting. I think I'd be a little bit lower, but that's interesting. We'll get more into some of these other players, and we don't want to talk too much about something that hasn't happened. But last year we
Sounds like
kind of
it's a
had to
done
prep
deal.
for players.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I know.
And, like,
But
honestly,
last year
that's
we
just
had
the
to
way
talk
the
about
Jets
football.
move. Like, remember, like, the Aaron Rodgers thing was a done deal for, like, 3 months until it was officially a done deal. Like, I wrote an article that we had sitting in our draft queue for, like, months before we could finally publish it because we knew it was done, and it just took forever to finally be announced.
This is part of fantasy football. It's prepping for option A, option B, and having a backup plan to your backup plan. Last year we had to do this with Jonathan Taylor, with
Mhm.
Aaron Rodgers, with Cooper Kupp, with Josh Jacobs. We needed to figure out what was going on with these players. So it's kind of good to know ahead of time where you're going to be. All right, let's drop down to tier number 3 here. Where at number 9, we're going to start with the rookie Marvin Harrison Jr. I've got him at 10. Dave, you've got him at 9. At number 10, we've got Drake London, who I've got him as my wide receiver 9. Dave, you've got him at 13. At 11, we've got Brandon Aiyuk. At 12, we've got Mike Evans. At 13, it's Nico Collins. At 14, it's Deebo Samuel. 15, Jaylen Waddle. 16, Chris Olave. And 17, DJ Moore. Now, we talked about Aaron Rodgers. We talked about the Jets. And we talked about Kirk Cousins and the Falcons. And we did the same thing when we got to our running back episode. We talked about Brees and we talked about Bijan. And here we are, the wide receiver episode. We just finished talking about Garrett Wilson and potentially Davante Adams going to the Jets. It kind of feels like these two teams are going to continue to be tied together because their quarterback situation is so similar, because their skill player situation is so similar. I'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Drake London here. I've got Drake London a little bit higher than you do. I've got him at 9. You've got him at wide receiver 13. I understand that I might be ranking London a bit higher. I might have him at his ceiling. But to me, a lot of it has to do with where I think the ceiling could be compared to the players around him. So, Dave, my question for you is why not have Drake London a bit closer to Garrett Wilson? They're in very similar, nearly identical situations. Wilson was the wide receiver 32 last year. I know that as a rookie, he was better, and we've seen him score more fantasy points, but all that has been predicated on volume. Whereas, at least for me, when I look at it, I see London he's had the bad quarterbacks, but he's also had a very run heavy approach. He's had a team that has refused to pass the ball or pass it efficiently. So, what kind of holds you back from putting Drake London as high as someone like Garrett Wilson now that we have a new coaching staff and Kirk Cousins on that team?
I just think there's a pretty significant talent gap between the two. I just think that Garrett Wilson is a much better
Okay.
player, and of course, they've both been in bad situations. Like we've talked about
Right.
that a ton, but you start comparing, what these guys have done together, and there's, like you said, a pretty wide gap. Last year, I'm of the belief that good players earn targets, and last year, Garrett Wilson had a over 30% target share. He was seventh in the league in his ability to draw targets. Well, Drake London was at 23%, 25th in the league. You look at the target rate, on a per
The
route
Jets
run
didn't really have
basis.
anyone else on the team. Like, the Jets don't have anyone else. At least we can say the Falcons had Kyle Pitts and they had Bijan Robinson. Like, I mean, the Jets really, it was Garrett Wilson and Brees, if
Yeah,
we're gonna say that.
yeah, and Brees had a higher target share than Bijan did. So, he
Mhm.
was still plenty involved in the passing game as well. I just think that Garrett Wilson's a better player than Drake London. We talked about this a little bit on the
Okay.
show with Chris a couple of weeks ago. I think Drake London is a very good player, and I think he could potentially finish as a wide receiver one. But like, if everything goes right for Garrett Wilson, if Davante Adams doesn't end up in New York, and Garrett Wilson is the wide receiver one for Aaron Rodgers, he could be a top three guy. I don't know if I ever see that ceiling for Drake London. I think that Drake London could be kind of a back end wide receiver one. He might squeak into the top 8 or something like that. But I don't think that he has the talent to break into that elite tier the way that Garrett Wilson could.
So looking at it right now, the Jets had 4 more pass attempts per game last year over the Falcons. I'm doing this as I'm talking. Last year, Garrett Wilson was at 9.9 targets per game, while Drake London was at 6.9. So we're
Right.
looking at players that had a difference of 3 targets. Not saying that those specific 4 pass attempts led to 3 more targets for Garrett Wilson, but there's small numbers where I do think this gap could close a bit, but I absolutely understand the trepidation for people saying I still don't want to trust Drake London yet. I do think Aaron Rodgers can support Garrett Wilson, and I actually agree with you. I do think Garrett Wilson is a better wide receiver than Drake London. I'm just willing to put them back to back because I feel like the situations are so similar.
Yeah, and I will say, like, all of these guys, and I've used the term flat a lot, like, just to explain that. Like, when I say there's like a flat stretch at a position, that just means that I see those guys as pretty similar. And like we talked about the flat stretch at
Yeah.
quarterbacks when I was saying Joe Burrow, CJ Stroud, Dak Prescott, Jordan Love, like those guys are all very, very similar for me. And when I look at this tier of receivers, Marvin Harrison, Drake London, Brandon Ayuk, Mike Evans, Nico Collins, Deebo Samuel, Jaylen Waddle, they're also pretty flat to me. Like I can see all of these guys have similar ranges of outcomes. And for me, you know, I don't especially like drafting these guys where they're going, because you're paying for these guys with second round picks, and it feels like what we should be doing here, based on what we've done historically. This feels like the range where we should be drafting Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry and Jonathan Taylor. But as we said, like, the wide receiver well dries up so quickly that you kind of force yourself into drafting wide receivers early. And this kind of feels like that kind of gross tier of high end wide receiver twos, but there's absolutely going to be gold in this tier. And maybe Drake London proves me wrong and finishes a top 3 guy. Maybe Brandon Ayuk, can maintain his efficiency in San Francisco and finishes a top 5 guy. Or maybe he gets traded and unlocks an even higher ceiling. The ceiling cases for all of these guys are kind of similar, but like
Mhm.
we're talking about differences in rankings between 9 and 13, which might sound like a lot, but I have all of these guys so close together that it's not as big as the numbers might make you think.
Yeah, remember when we separate a player between wide receiver 9 and 13, it could quite literally be a projection differential of 2 points, 3 points,
Oh,
4
less than
points.
less than
It
that. Yeah, it could be
even
half a
less.
point.
I was
Half a
trying to
point
be a
per
little
game.
less
Yeah.
hyperbolic here, but yeah, exactly. Like there's such a minimal difference between them. Sometimes it just comes down to preference in play style, in ceiling, in offense, in some of these more intangible things that we can't put on a stat sheet.
Here, last year, here's a fun fact for you. Last year, the difference between the
Fun
wide
fact.
receiver 9 and the wide receiver 13 was point 0.6 points per game. So, I mean, really, really
Gorgeous.
splitting hairs here. And I just pulled out those arbitrary numbers because that was the difference in our rankings,
Can't
for Drake London. But really, like, half a point per game is the difference between these guys in this tier, most likely.
You're an idiot. You should have him half a point higher. You damn fool. All right, two more guys that I want to talk about from this tier, and we'll move on because I think the next tier might be my favorite just to talk about and to draft. But two guys in this tier that you moved up your rankings quite a bit higher than last time when we spoke, and you're a bit higher on these guys than I am. Nico Collins, you have him as your wide receiver 10. You've moved him up 5 spots.
Mhm.
And then Jaylen Waddle is your wide receiver 12. You moved him up 9 spots. Just talk specifically about those guys. What has changed as you've been doing your research? I know that you did these team deep dives with Jeff Bell, that you've got the audio on our podcast feed. It's both in the Dynasty feed and the Football Guys Fantasy podcast feed. But what came up in your research that you said, you know what, I've got to not just move these guys up, but move them up quite a bit?
With Nico Collins, I thought we were getting a little bit overexcited, and it's something that you and I talked about way early in the offseason when we were doing our dynasty wide receiver rankings. And I told you I thought that you were crazy for ranking Nico Collins as high as you did, and talk about the lack of draft capital and the 2 years of mediocrity and all this sort of stuff. And I was trying to find so many reasons to be out on Nico Collins. And I think that was kind of a psychological exercise for me because I've been a huge Nico Collins fan for years. And then he finally broke out. Everybody got on the Nico Collins train, and I had that like that hipster distaste, when like that underground band goes mainstream, and you're like, ugh, I don't like him anymore. That's how I felt about Nico Collins, and that was a me problem. All right, that wasn't.
As you were sipping your IPA, got it.
Yeah, yeah, and I was just like, no, like you guys can't like Nico. I like Nico Collins before he was cool. Like I don't like Nico Collins anymore. That's kind of where I was at. And then I just realized, like, what am I doing here? Like, this guy got paid. He's tied to CJ Stroud. He just balled out last year. He was second in the league in yards per route run. And I righted my wrong and moved him back to where he belongs. So I think Nico Collins should be drafted as a top 10 guy. I mean, I think he's going to be the clear cut wide receiver 1 on this team. He can do it all. I've talked about him for years as a guy that I've liked. He's a good route runner. He's big. He's aggressive, makes plays after the catch. He can go up and get the ball at the catch point. Nico Collins does everything you want to see in a prototypical wide receiver 1. And then Jaylen Waddle, I've talked about him a little bit before too. I was really big on Jaylen Waddle last year. And I think that my reason for being low on him in my early offseason rankings was, again, just me. It was a me problem. Like I was burned because I drafted a ton of Jaylen Waddle last year and he was hurt. But like you look at what he's done through his first 3 years in the NFL, he can do it all. He can be a target earner. He can be an efficiency guy. He can win deep downfield. He can make plays after the catch. And we saw like in the games he was healthy last year, he was fantastic. He was just always hurt. Like this guy spent so much of his season in the blue 10 on the sidelines. So I think that was another one for me where I just kind of had to remove my biases and look at this as objectively as possible. And I said, regardless of how bad Jaylen Waddle burned me last year, I got to move him back up my rankings.
Yeah, last year was tough for Jaylen Waddle. I'm looking at it right now. He only had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games over a 70% snap rate, which for a team that has such a condensed
Yeah.
target tree and a team that really only uses a few weapons, it's not good. And it's not a Jaylen Waddle thing. It was luck of injury at that time because this is a player who's been pretty healthy throughout his career and been playing for the Miami Dolphins.
And it
So
seemed like it was
last year's
the
just bad
same
luck.
injuries last year, right? Like it was his back that like kept bothering him. Like you'd see him take a shot in the
Yeah.
back and then all of a sudden he'd be limping off to the sidelines. And it seemed like even the games where he wasn't on the injury report, you could tell he just like wasn't 100%. But I just want to go back to like real quickly. I talked about him kind of doing it all. His rookie season, like what we loved about him is that he pulled a 25% target share as a rookie. We said like, wow, that's crazy to be able to earn that type of target share first year in the league. And then in year 2, Tyreek Hill showed up and that dipped to a 21% target share, which wasn't nearly as exciting. But then he jumped to 2.8 yards per route run, which was 4th best in the league. So That's what I'm saying about Jaylen Waddle. There's no reason not to like him. Like, he can be an elite target earner if Tyreek Hill is on the field. And if Tyreek Hill isn't on the field, then he can, or I'm sorry, I had that flip flopped. If Tyreek Hill is on the field, he can be wildly efficient with his touches. And when Tyreek Hill isn't on the field, he's going to prop up his production with elite volume. So he can be a volume guy, he can be an efficiency guy, he can really do it all. If Tyreek Hill's there, he's going to be productive. If Tyreek Hill's not there, he's going to be productive. Yeah, Jaylen Waddle, great football player. That's all I got to say.
I'll say this. I think the window to go buy Jaylen Waddle in Dynasty might be open right now because that
Mhm.
might slam shut if he starts playing well again this season.
Yeah.
This is the opportunity. Guy that's still very young and has been very productive.
Before we go to the next tier,
All
I
right.
just want to point out
Yep.
DJ Moore real quickly because that's another guy that, like,
Of course, you want to
I
talk
have
about a
to.
bear.
I have to, but it's not even a bear. Like, I was a huge DJ Moore fan before he came to the Bears, but this guy has basically shown us that he's quarterback proof throughout his career. Like, almost a lock for 1,000 yards a season during his time in Carolina when he was catching passes from, the ghost of Cam Newton and Kyle Allen. Like, it didn't matter who was there, he was still productive. And then last year, the huge talking point about the Chicago Bears is that their quarterback play was terrible, whether it was Justin Fields or Tyson Bagent, and he still went for over 1,350 yards. Now we're looking at DJ Moore in an improved quarterback room. Now he's got Caleb Williams there, which should be better than the play he got last year. And I understand that there's some concerns about, Roma Dunze and Keenan Allen and how they could impact his target share and his target
Um,
volume. But we've seen DJ Moore, still relatively young, has been the wide receiver one every step along the way. If a 32-year-old Keenan Allen is causing some sort of buy window for DJ Moore, whether it be getting him cheaper in your redraft leagues or buying him for cheap in Dynasty, DJ Moore has done nothing but prove that he is an elite wide receiver one. So I'm still A-OK drafting him, even with some of these concerns going into 2023, 2024.
that year too.
That
Either
year,
one.
yeah, yeah.
Either one. Dave, I just want you to I just want you to stop talking about the Bears.
I
Thank
talked more about the Dolphins than I talked about the Bears in that little,
Right. Now
yeah.
and it's okay to shut up after that. Sorry. All right. Tier number 4. Let's move on here. This is the one that I said is actually one of my favorite tiers because I think that we've got a lot of really high upside guys that are at some great discounts, some second year players, some third year guys, players that really could pay big dividends in your redraft league. So tier number 4, we start at 18 with Davante Adams, 19 Michael Pittman Jr., 20 DK Metcalf, 21 Amari Cooper, 22 T Higgins, 23 Cooper Kupp, 24 DeVonta Smith, 25 Tank Dell, and 26 Zay Flowers. Dave, I know we're not very excited about Davante Adams, but we do have him at the top of this tier. We're not going to talk much about him because we have talked about him in previous episodes. Please go back and check those out, whether it's players that we're avoiding drafting at ADP or, when we've talked about the wide receiver position and some of those early landmines to avoid. What I do want to talk about here, okay, is we each have 2 players that it seems like based on our rankings, we believe they should be in the tier above this one before this. So it's to me, it looks like you have a preference for Michael Pittman, who you've got at your wide receiver 17. And then for me, it's DK Metcalf, who I have as my wide receiver 16. Talk to me a little bit about Michael Pittman and what keeps him up there for you, or potentially even being back up in that tier 3, because we are going to get finally a full season with Anthony Richardson. The Colts do add Adonai Mitchell. They are going to get a full season from Jonathan Taylor. I'm not trying to dispute what you're saying, but I'm kind of putting out everything there that someone might be thinking and as to why they might have Michael Pittman a bit lower. So what makes you keep him higher in your wide receiver rankings?
He is definitely one of the safer plays. Like, I don't think Michael Pittman is ever going to be a top 5 type of wide receiver, but when you're looking for a wide receiver too, he's a high end wide receiver too that you can plug in your lineup and get consistent production from just about every single week. And what's going to happen with Anthony Richardson, I think is a tough discussion to have, because if you look at Michael Pittman last year with Anthony Richardson, his best game of the season came with Richardson and his worst game of the season came with Richardson. So we don't really have a clear picture as to like whether he's going to benefit from playing with Richardson or not. But this is just a good football player. He was injured his rookie season, and I was big on him going into year 2. Broke out in year 2 for over 1,000 yards. Dealt with some injuries again in 2022, and then last year we saw his best season, 1,150 yards. I just think he's a good player. He's consistently open across the middle of the field. think he makes the quarterback's job a little bit easier when he's able to just be sitting there right across the middle of the field with his hands outstretched 10 yards in front of the ball. And again, like, I don't think that he has a huge ceiling here, but he's a guy that you can plug in as your wide receiver too, and he's probably going to finish the year somewhere between the top 15 and top 20.
Yeah, taking a look at it right now, Michael Pittman, targets and receptions have increased every single year of his career. Where I get a little bit worried about the ceiling is I think that we've already seen it. I think we saw probably a best case scenario where he is getting hyper targeted, with a guy like Gardner Minshew. We've seen it even before that with Matt Ryan out there. We see most of the season here where there's not an established Jonathan Taylor running game. And so that's my only worry when I'm trying to rank a guy like Pittman, is that we've already seen the ceiling. For me, looking at DK Metcalf, this is the guy that I have ranked essentially outside of this tier. So much of this for me is what's going to be changing on offense, and having Ryan Grubb as the offensive coordinator, and something that's really going to fit what DK Metcalf has done so well. I think we're going to see a big improvement from Geno Smith, who's going to be able to go back to what he likes to do, which is chucking the ball downfield, not doing these dink and dunk passes. I don't think we're going to see as much of a commitment to the run, which may hurt guys like Ken Walker and Zach Charbonnet, but we may see them get used in the passing game more often. This is a team that I think we're going to see the offensive identity shift a little bit. And we talk about safe floors for both these guys. We've seen DK Metcalf be the wide receiver 7 overall, the wide receiver 12 overall. He's basically never finished lower than wide receiver 18 over the last 4 seasons here. And that's in half PPR. So DK Metcalf is a guy that I'm very comfortable ranking at wide receiver 16. I think that he could even go a little bit higher with the touchdown variance that we could see. I think for me, and let's just get out of the numbers, let's get out of, whatever the statistical analysis might be. I'm excited about the fact that we could see DK Metcalf in what was the Rome Odunze role for Washington, at University of Washington last season, and see that for Seattle here, because that is where their offensive coordinator has come from. And that's what has me excited. I think that we don't quite know what Jackson Smith-Njigba is going to be. We want to assume that we know. The role there is still kind of nebulous. We don't really know how much left we have of Tyler Lockett. That's also kind of nebulous. They're the one true thing that I know about the Seahawks offense. DK Metcalf is really good, and he's going to be in a high volume and big play role. That's the way I keep looking at it.
Yeah, and I like DK Metcalf as a player, and I shared some of my weighted leverage on Twitter yesterday, and I was kind of shocked to see it that DK Metcalf, I have more negative weighted leverage on Metcalf than anybody else. And what that means is basically like factoring
Yeah.
in where a player's getting drafted, their ADP, and how often I have drafted them. I'm basically betting
Got it.
against DK Metcalf more than any other player this year. And I was kind of shocked to see that. And I got some pushback for it on Twitter as well, as I'm sure you could imagine. And it really just comes down to like other players that are
No,
going in
you
his,
getting
yeah,
pushback on Twitter?
who'd have thunk it?
That
Yeah.
doesn't happen.
But it just comes down to like the other players that are going in that range. I just prefer almost everybody going in that range over DK Metcalf. Cooper Kupp, Malik Nabers, DJ Moore, Derrick Henry, Kyron Williams. When those guys are on the board, it's really tough for me to draft DK Metcalf. And I like DK Metcalf as a player. And I like that he has that game breaking upside anytime he touches the ball and that he can be more of a red zone threat. But it just comes down to the opportunity cost for me. And when I'm in a draft and I'm looking at Derrick Henry or Kyron Williams or Cooper Kupp or DJ Moore, and I'm trying to decide between one of them and DK Metcalf, I just can't click on DK Metcalf there.
So I do want to make sure, like, let's expand here, because that is a little bit of best ball brain. I do want to fix like some things, because DK Metcalf does go higher in best ball.
Mhm.
When we look at redraft leagues, he is going fourth
Oh, I saw on
round.
Yahoo he's going like 49th overall, which is like the top of the 5th round. And like at that cost, yeah, I'm way in, but he's going,
But let's put him
yeah.
around other players at same position, around, like, same thing. It's DK Metcalf or Stefon Diggs.
Oh,
I'm going
Metcalf
DK Metcalf.
easily. Yeah, easily Metcalf.
Now it's DK Metcalf or DJ Moore. I think I'm going DK Metcalf there. I know you're probably going more.
Yeah, I got more slightly ahead of Metcalf.
And then the other wide receiver is going to be DK Metcalf or Cooper Kupp.
And I do prefer Cooper Kupp there.
Okay. Okay. And let's talk about that then, because Cooper Kupp is a guy that you actually moved up 7 spots in your ranks now. He is your wide receiver 21 since last time we spoke. I'm very intrigued about this. What made you move Cooper Kupp up your ranks? Because like we talk about, nothing changes in the offseason except our rankings, really. It's still the same players on the same teams. We're just learning new information. So what makes you move him up? Because I kept him the same at wide receiver 24. He has not moved for me, but now he's gone quite a bit up your rankings.
Well, I commend you, Alfredo, for sticking to your guns throughout the offseason. But again, just like with some of the other guys that we talked about, Nico Collins and Jaylen
Yeah.
Waddle, guys that I was very in on last year that kind of burned me. Or not, well, Nico. Nico didn't burn me, but you know what I'm saying. Like, trying to kind of face your biases head on. And that was Cooper Kupp. Like, Cooper Kupp was my guy last year. Like, he was my 103 off the boards. I was drafting him, and he had a terrible year. So when I
We
did
both
my,
love Cooper Kupp.
yeah,
We
how
like
could
we
you
did a
not?
whole episode about how you could win your league
Mhm.
by drafting Cooper Kupp over anyone else in the
All right,
first
all right.
round.
Don't tell people that, all right?
I'm just
Yeah,
yeah.
mm.
Don't
No,
unsubscribe,
we never
please.
said that. Yeah, we were both out on Cooper Kupp last year, and no, but Cooper Kupp, it was the hamstring injury. Like, it was a preseason hamstring
Yeah.
injury, and it was a punch in the gut for me because I had Cooper Kupp on almost every single team. Like I said, I was taking him as the 103 off the board, and then he tweaks his hamstring in the preseason, and I lost sleep over it that night. I was like, I have invested so much money into these 31-year-old hamstrings. You got to be kidding me. And he never really returned to form. So when I did my initial runs of ranking after the season, I said, Cooper Kupp, you're going down. I'm just moving you as far down as I want nothing to do with you. And then, like I had to do with some other players, I had to face my biases and say, wait, actually, when Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua were on the field together, you dig into the numbers a little bit and you realize it was a 1A, 1B situation. Like we talked about with Puka Nacua a couple of weeks ago, being kind of a risky player to go in round one. That risk comes from the fact that Cooper Kupp had some fluky injuries last year. And like maybe he is just getting old and trending down like a lot of receivers do around this age. Maybe it was just a fluky hamstring injury that bothered him all season. And maybe he could bounce back to being the 25 point per game guy that he was 2 years ago. So, the ceiling is still there for Cooper Kupp. And you look at this tier: Davante Adams, Michael Pittman, DK Metcalf, Amari Cooper, T. Higgins, Cooper Kupp, DeVonta Smith, Tank Dell, Zay Flowers. Would you agree, Alfredo, that nobody has as high of a ceiling as Cooper Kupp?
Yeah. I think that's very fair because we've seen it. We've seen Cooper Kupp be the wide receiver one overall. So yeah, I think that's absolutely the ceiling there.
And
And
I
Dave,
think
you
that's
joke
it.
and you
He's a dangerous pick. He's probably also got the
yeah,
lowest floor of anybody in this tier. But
yes.
if there's one guy from this tier that's going to average 25 points per game, it's going to be Cooper Kupp or Davante Adams with Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah. God, please no. You mentioned like good for me for sticking to my guns. It's not even that, dude. Like it's first of all, let's just put this out there. We are human. Okay, as much as we try to take emotion and intangible thought process out of all this, it's always there. We are people. We're going to do that. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to like move players up and down or just keep them the same. And me keeping Cooper Kupp at 24 is not me sticking to my guns. It's me saying, I don't know what the hell to do with him. So I just put him next to a bunch of the other sort of second wide receivers on their teams. And, what's the volume going to be like? Do they have injury concerns? Wide receiver 24 just seems like the best place for me to keep him because if I can draft him there, he's a value, and I don't want to have to try to draft him earlier than that. And so that's got the kind of process that goes into us ranking these players. All right, well, there's a few other guys here that I look at and I kind of say, I know that Cooper Kupp is the guy that could have the highest ceiling. That floor sort of scares me.
Mhm.
There are four players in this tier that I love that are all going in the fifth round. And I'll say them in order of their ADP: Tank Dell, T. Higgins, Amari Cooper, and Zay Flowers. If you had to pick one out of those four, Dell, Higgins, Cooper, and Flowers, who are you going with?
Man, that's a tough question. These are like four of my favorite guys to draft. And I find myself
Same.
like just drafting these guys as much as I can and kind of often hoping that like the drafters will make the decision for me. Like I love when just one of these guys is left and I get to pick them and I don't have to make a choice because I struggle with these four. Like they're very close for me in my rankings. I think talking highest ceiling though, you know, if we're talking like potential upside that unlocks the ceiling, I think that's T. Higgins. Like if Jamar Chase goes down, we could be looking at a huge ceiling for T. Higgins. But in a world where we're not predicting injuries, I think the guy with the highest ceiling is Tank Dell because we saw last year once Tank Dell got fully up to speed, Nico Collins was eating and Tank Dell was eating, and they were both giving us top 10 production. So I think that's kind of the ceiling play for Tank Dell is that he can be a 28% target share type of guy. But not only is he drawing a ton of targets, he's drawing those targets deep downfield and he's making plays after the catch. So I think if there's one guy that could like break fantasy football from this year, it's Tank Dell just because of his speed and his chemistry with CJ Stroud.
I'm going to agree with you 100% there. These are my favorite guys to draft, and Tank Dell is that guy that I will not going to add anything to it. Like he can absolutely break fantasy football, especially at the ADP that he's going. I love it.
So he has the highest ceiling, but I will say my favorite guy to pick here is Amari Cooper, who
Yeah, we
might
both have him ranked
realistic.
high out of this group.
Yeah, and it's Amari Cooper, man. Like what? He's going into like year 8 in the league or something now. Like he's been around for a minute, but he is just so good. And like he might not have that top 5 upside, but you do see the huge spike weeks, like his 52-point game in the semifinals last year that got a lot of people into their fantasy football playoffs. He has that huge weekly upside, but it's just like every single year Amari Cooper is going to finish inside the top 20. He's going to finish somewhere between 10 and 20 every single year. Might not have the league winning season long upside, but he's about as safe of a player as you can draft in this range.
And we often use this as our cop out, but he's also the cheapest of these
Yeah.
4 wide receivers in drafts. So
Yeah.
he's going last. So good pick. All right, let's jump down to the next tier number 5, where it's a big tier. And I feel like there's just a lot of the same. You say that the wide receivers get flat. This is where I think it is the absolute flattest. Kyrie Irving would love this tier. Hold for laughter. Hold for
We
laughter.
could
There
just
we
on
go.
Aaron Rodgers again. We can go back to that.
All right. Number 27, we've got Malik Nabers, 28, George Pickens, 29, Marquise Brown, 30, Christian Kirk, 31, Diontae Johnson, 32, Keenan Allen, 33, Stefon Diggs, 34, Rashee Rice, 35, Terry McLaurin, 36, Chris Godwin, 37, Calvin Ridley, and 38, DeAndre Hopkins. Dave, one thing I noticed is that we keep moving Stefon Diggs lower and lower and lower and lower. And I think you and I just don't want anything to do with him until he becomes a value for us in our drafts. I dropped him from my wide receiver 28 down to wide receiver 33. So 5 spots. And then Dave, you dropped him from your wide receiver 24 down to 31. So that's 7 spots for you.
Mm.
We don't have to get into it. We've talked so much about Stefon
Yeah.
Diggs. Like I'm not trying to get more angry Texans fans telling us how stupid we are than the Bills fans saying how smart we are. Like we get it. We've talked enough about it. But one thing I do notice here, I noticed that Rashee Rice remains wide receiver 28 for you.
Mhm.
And Hollywood Brown, also pretty high for you. Not pictured and not discussed in this episode, is going to be Xavier Worthy for the Kansas City Chiefs. He's outside of your top 50. So I just kind of have to ask, is that how you see this Chiefs passing game shaking out more or less, where it's going to be Hollywood Brown as the main guy, Rashee Rice doing some underneath stuff, and then Xavier Worthy sort of finding his spots here and there as the season goes on?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And you kind of have to plant a flag on this wide receiver room, I feel. And I think Rashee Rice, of course, like if Rashee Rice wasn't facing a potential suspension, we'd be looking at him as like a second round pick, right? Like I think that's the only thing that's really concern right now. Like there's no reason that Rashee Rice shouldn't be getting drafted in the Brandon Aiyuk, Mike Evans, Nico Collins type of range, but we're fading him a little bit because there's concern that he misses 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks. We don't know, but that concern is, I think, what's causing him to get pushed down in ADP a little bit. But I don't see him and Marquise Brown as wide receivers that are going to negatively impact each other. I think that they help each other out. They're both very good players, and we both know exactly what their skill sets are. Where Rashee Rice is going to work underneath, Marquise Brown is going to be able to work behind Rashee Rice, and I think that they complement each other very well. So I think both could easily finish inside the top 30. If we get word that Rashee Rice is avoiding a suspension, I'm moving him up even higher. But these are both guys that I really, really like to draft.
See, what I'll say is this: is I think that you have Rashee Rice a little bit closer to where I would be drafting him if he wasn't suspended. Because to me, like the Chiefs go and they add 2 wide receivers. Rashee Rice, his floor and ceiling, it to me is not too dissimilar to a guy like Tank Dell, who I have at wide receiver 25. We've got Zay Flowers. I've got him at wide receiver 26. T. Higgins at 23. I don't know that I'd be moving him up that much, even if we got, word that there is no suspension coming. So for me, with the suspension, and you might be right. Like I think sometimes we devalue a player too much because of suspension. For this is I I have to put it in there somehow. Like I have to weigh that somehow. Maybe I'm still too low on him, and he is an incredible draft value, and I should have him a little bit higher. Um, I think the effect that it has right now in your rankings on Marquise Brown is very interesting. You moved him up 13 spots. You've got him at wide receiver 27. That's, I think it might be one of the highest in the industry. So Talk about that a little bit because obviously it's Patrick Mahomes, right? Like he can support 3 receivers. He can support 3 receivers and a tight end. He can support 3 receivers, a tight end, and a running back. Do we also just kind of get to a point where we say maybe you don't have to plant a flag on any of these guys and you just draft Patrick Mahomes where he is, the same way we talked about Jordan Love and the Packers wide receivers?
Yeah, can I just save some screen time? I could just link the article that
Do
I
it.
just wrote on Marquise Brown in the replies below. I mean, I just wrote like 2,000 words
Beautiful.
on why I think Marquise Brown is going to break out, and it's just like he is exactly what has been missing from this offense since Tyreek Hill has left. Like every receiver is either running nothing but 9 routes or nothing but underneath routes, and Marquise Brown is that guy that's versatile enough to do it all. So I think that he'll get some creative usage from Andy Reid, the same way that Tyreek Hill did, where he'll get moved into the slot, he'll get moved out wide. You'll never know what type of route he's running. He's so skilled at being able to make a defender think he's doing one thing and then do something else. You know, he can fake the little cutback and then get deep. There's just so many creative ways to use Marquise Brown. Like you knew when you saw Marquez Valdez-Scantling on the field that he was just going to be running downfield in a straight line as fast as he could. You knew when you saw Justin
That's
Watson on
for
the
true.
field.
He would be dropping the ball as well.
He would, yeah, yeah. And Justin Watson would also be running down the field as quickly as he can. And then you'd see Rashee Rice, and you knew that he was going to run an in-breaking route. And you'd see Travis Kelce, and you knew that he was going to run a post route. Like it's just like everything was so predictable last year for the Chiefs. And Marquise Brown is that unpredictable element that can really raise every single player around him. So that's why I say that I think that he and Rashee Rice are very complementary in what they can do. And it's not that it's going to open up the tool bag that we saw from Rashee Rice last year. I think that he's still pretty limited in what he can do at the NFL level. But when Marquise Brown is forcing defenses to play on their heels and he's stretching those defenses vertically a little bit more, then it just opens up even more underneath for Rashee Rice. So I think that there is absolutely a world where Travis Kelce, Rashee Rice, and Marquise Brown can all coexist. We see both of the wide receivers finish inside the top 24. We see Travis Kelce still finish as a top 3 wide receiver. And I think that the passing game just really focuses on those 3 guys.
I'm more inclined to just stay away simply because I don't think we're going to be able to figure out who's going to be the primary target earner in this offense except for Travis Kelce. And I think that's just, if we think that we are going to be able to figure out Andy Reid and his offense when other NFL defensive coordinators can't do it, I'm not going to try. And so I'd rather either just take my pick with Travis Kelce or Patrick Mahomes and reap the benefits of having Patrick Mahomes, or just avoid the Chiefs altogether because I won't know who to pick. And right now, taking a look at it, Marquise Brown, Rashee Rice are going in the early 7th round of early fantasy football drafts right now. Xavier Worthy, we talked about the cop out. Xavier Worthy's going mid 8th, sometimes early 9th. So if you are looking for the absolute cheapest option, you don't know who to take, that becomes an option for you. Dave, let's move down to our final tier number 6 here, as we finish out our top 48 wide receivers. At 39, we've got Jaden Reed. At 40, Christian Watson. 41, Rome Odunze. 42, Jordan Addison. 43, Ladd McConkey. 44, Tyler Lockett. 45, Cortland Sutton. 46, Jackson Smith-Njigba. 47, Brian Thomas Jr. And 48, Jacoby Myers. So I want to talk about this right out of the jump here because this is it's news. It's new news. Jordan Addison has, he's been arrested for a DUI. We have to see what the league ends up saying. Typically, I'm taking this right off of Twitter. According to the NFL's policy and program for substances of abuse, absent aggravating circumstances, discipline for a first offense DUI is suspension without pay for 3 games. Discipline for a second or subsequent offense is 8 games. Now, for those who remember, Jordan Addison did have another traffic violation. That was simply him speeding. I believe it was reckless driving. I don't quite remember the charge, but it had nothing to do with driving under the influence.
Taking his dog to the vet? Wasn't that what the story was?
I don't know, but I would break every single law to get my dog to the vet if we're just going to say that. So I get it. But one, just guys, even if you're not in the NFL, like just be safe, man. Call an Uber, call a friend, just walk. Don't get behind the wheel of a car if you've been drinking or doing anything else. But let's talk about the fantasy football side of this. Get off the soapbox for a second and talk about Jordan Addison here. We already were not very high on him, but if he gets the 3-game suspension like is expected, does he drop even further down your rankings? You've got him at wide receiver 42. I've got him at wide receiver 43. Does he almost become undraftable for you at that point where you're just like dropping him out of the top 50?
I mean, he's pretty much undraftable for me at this point. He's going to be the wide receiver too for Sam Darnold or JJ McCarthy. And then, if we're expecting TJ Hawkinson to come back at any point in this season, which he probably will, but like that's the worst case scenario is like you're already looking at Jordan Addison as a wide receiver too. And then in weeks 13, 14,
For his
15.
team, not for your
Right,
fantasy
right,
team.
right,
You're
for his
looking
team,
at
the
it as more
wide
like a
receiver
wide receiver
2
4
of
for your
his team.
fantasy team.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
then TJ Hawkinson gets shuffled back into the fold right before the fantasy playoffs, and then all of a sudden he's the 3rd pass catching option on, again, either a Sam Darnold or JJ McCarthy-led offense. I just haven't really wanted anything to do with Jordan Addison, and if I draft him knowing that he's looking at a potential 3 to 8 game suspension to start the year, that just makes me want him even less. So I think he's a good football player. Like what we saw last year was impossible to ignore, but given the target competition, given the quarterback room, there's just so much risk here. There's a lot of wide receivers and a lot of running backs that I would prefer ahead of Jordan Addison.
As we were talking, I just started moving Jordan Addison even further down my rankings. I dropped him down to wide receiver 46. So what you're seeing
All
on the
right. Well, I'll
screen is
drop
not
him to
necessarily
wide receiver 50, and then
reflective.
he's outside of our top 48, and there's no more reason to discuss him on this show.
And now the show just got stupid. All right. Yeah, actually, I moved Ladd McConkey ahead of him. Who else did I move? I moved Ladd McConkey ahead of him, Brian Thomas ahead of him, Cortland Sutton ahead of him, and I think where I sort of drew that line is Tyler Lockett, where I don't know if there's a huge difference between potential wide receiver 3 of the Seahawks and wide receiver 2 of the Vikings there. So that's kind of where I draw that line. One of the guys I mentioned there, Brian Thomas Jr., who I have now at my wide receiver 44. You dropped him a few spots here down to your wide receiver 50. I guess Jordan Addison has that spot now. So Brian Thomas Jr. at wide receiver 49. But I noticed you're a bit lower on both of the top 2 receivers for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Is that simply you're worried about their ceiling? Are you worried about Trevor Lawrence? Are you worried about the Jaguars offense in general? Are you going to say all of the above?
Yeah, all the above. And I think Trevor Lawrence, I
Yeah.
mean, he likes to spread the ball out. Like even though Evan Ingram had a ton of targets last year, Christian Kirk had a ton of targets as well. Like when Zay Jones was out there, he was getting targets, and Calvin Ridley was getting targets, and Travis Etienne was getting targets. And I think that's my biggest fear with Trevor Lawrence is that so many quarterbacks, and especially young quarterbacks, really like to lock in on their number one guy. And I could see Trevor Lawrence just, he finds the open guy regardless of where he is. Like he's great at throwing across the middle of the field. He's great at throwing outside as well. So that's kind of my concern is that Christian Kirk's going to be involved. Gabe Davis is going to be involved. Brian Thomas Jr. is going to be involved. Evan Ingram. They're still going to run the ball a lot. And I'm just not sure that any of these guys really presents the highest ceiling. Now, I love the long-term landing spot for Brian Wilson or Brian Thomas with Trevor
Him too.
Lawrence. But with Gabe Davis there right now, I'm not even sure that Brian Thomas is going to be a full-time player. Like they might split that role that we saw designated to Calvin Ridley last year. And I think long term, I love Brian Thomas. Like he's my 107 in rookie drafts this year. I think that he's a very good player. I was stoked with the landing spot, but I just don't have the highest expectations for 2023 because he still does need some development. He's a very um, slender guy that doesn't play with a
Yeah.
lot of physicality, and you can get away with that in college, but I don't know if he has the speed to get away with that in the NFL. So I think to become a better NFL player, he's going to need to bulk up a little bit. Going to need to learn to play a little bit more aggressively and play through contact, and we could probably see that next year, but I don't know if he's going to be able to immediately take that step in his rookie season.
He's currently being drafted in the middle of round 9 around guys like JSN, Cortland Sutton, Jamison Williams, Keon Coleman.
You
I
know who
think
I'm
that fits.
drafting here, Alfredo? The running
Oh boy.
backs.
Yeah, that's fair.
This is
That's
not a
fair.
tier of receiver that I really enjoy all that much.
Well, then, so let's pick the best of the worst. If you have to pick one guy out of this tier 6 that you're saying, I love the upside, I want him, and I swear to everything
It's not
that is
Romadunte.
football guys. Thank you.
No, it's
Okay, I
it's
thought
Christian
you were going to
Watson.
say it.
It's Christian
Yeah,
Watson for
same,
me.
same. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
We agreed.
yeah, it's Christian Watson. Dwayne McFarland dropped the stat on our show a while back, or it was on the Friday best ball stream that we did, but he looked at all of the plays where Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, and Romeo Dobbs all played on the field together, and it was a small sample size. I think it was just about 150 routes run or something like that. But Christian Watson led in every statistical category. I think that he is very clear cut the wide receiver one, and it kind of confuses me. I think I might have it ranked this way. Yeah, I have Christian Watson one spot ahead of Jaden Reed, so like not a crazy stance by any means, but it is kind of crazy to me that ADP outright prefers Jaden Reed to Christian Watson when I think the only thing that's held Christian Watson back so far has been his health. And again, he might not have the crazy high ceiling that we projected for him when he was drafted. He might not be that top 3, top 5 game breaker that we had hoped for. But I think it's still very possible that he could finish inside the top 15 or the top 20. And I find every other receiver in this tier, I don't really see the path for that.
Well, he's been a top 24 fantasy wide receiver in roughly 35% of his games played so far in his career. So we know that there is a ceiling. And there's been so many times where he's been a top 10 wide receiver, even. And I think that number is probably even more impressive because he's been very boom or bust. And I think what we just want to see here is we want to see a guy play a full season.
Yeah.
And when you can get him where he's going in drafts where you're looking at Christian Watson going at the end of the 10th, early 9th round, I will take that upside every single day, especially when you're comparing him to the guys I listed before. Brian Thomas, Lad McConkey, JSN, Cortland Sutton. I'll take Christian Watson over every single one of those guys. I'm taking Christian Watson over Jordan Addison, Roma Dunze, everyone else in this tier. So, Dave, I'm with you 100% there.
And then we just quickly glossed over Lad McConkey's name. I don't know how much time we have left on this.
I said his name twice. We just didn't dive
Okay,
into it.
you
I don't know
glossed
what
over
to
his
do
name
with the
twice.
Chargers. I don't know what to do with the Chargers, man. Like we keep wanting to believe that he's going to be this Keenan Allen surrogate, but we've also got a college guy who has never really finished a full season. He's never really been a prolific producer. We want to assume he's going to go right into this slot role, but we don't know. And we've also got a team that's going to be passing less. I want to be excited. I don't know that the ceiling is necessarily there for Lad McConkey.
I don't know if the ceiling's there either, but the target volume could be, which would, could give him a path to a top 24 finish or so. I just look at the rest of the pass catchers there. And like Joshua Palmer, I think he's a good football player, but we know that he's not going to draw the targets or have the fantasy production to really be relevant. DJ Chark, I mean, yeah, he had like a good 4-game stretch 4 years ago, and we're still clinging on to that. But like, there really is just nobody else there. And like, we know Justin Herbert's good, and we've talked so much this offseason, not just us, Twitter, I'm sure other shows are talking about it as well. I want to know because I don't listen to them, but I'm sure that everybody is saying
So
Justin
cool.
Herbert's not going to throw the ball at all. They're going to run the ball a ton. And I know that's what the narrative is out there, but like Justin Herbert is just a lock for 4,000 yards a season. And like, even if they do lean on the run a little bit heavier, what if we're all just wrong? And what if Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman do install a new offense here? But what if it still does have Justin Herbert throwing a lot? And what if Lad McConkey is the wide receiver one here? It's just like we are so certain in this point in the season that we know exactly what the offense is going to look like and where the targets are going to go, but we're wrong all the time. And if I'm going to bet on a guy that we could be wrong on, Lad McConkey being the Chargers wide receiver one seems like a pretty good hedge against the industry consensus.
We talk about this all the time, though. Wide receiver one doesn't mean the same thing on every single team.
Right.
So we put it this way: if I told you that Lad McConkey was going to catch 80 passes for 800 yards and 4 touchdowns, that seems extremely realistic, right?
Yeah.
That would put him somewhere around wide receiver 48 or 46, probably, in terms of projections. So it feels like he's going where he's going. We would need to see that the ceiling can be much higher than him catching some volume.
But what if that
That's
volume
where I'm
ends
at
up
with
being 1,200 yards and 8 touchdowns? Then all of a sudden we're looking at a much better player. And I think that
I mean,
we can't
yards and 8
discount
touchdowns,
that
we're talking about a
possibility.
guy that's yeah, I mean, we you're right. You're right. We can't discount that possibility, but I think that's why he's even going this high to begin with, because we're not taking any other Chargers player.
Yeah, and I think he's really, I mean, outside of Gus Edwards and maybe some super late round darts on Kamani Vidal and J.K. Dobbins. I mean, McConkey is really the only guy that I'm interested in. Like, I'm not doing Josh Palmer again. We've tried that and it hasn't worked. And Quentin Johnston, sure, like
Staying
Quentin
away.
Johnson is there in
Staying
like
away.
round 14. I might throw a dart, but like I don't want DJ Chark or Darius Davis or Brendan Rice or Cornelius Johnson or anybody else. Like I'm willing to take a chance on Lad McConkey.
You know what? You upset me, and I'm moving Ladd McConkey down my rankings behind Brian Thomas here
Oh,
just to finish the show.
I am moving him
Ladd
up to
McConkey is
balance it
now
out.
he's now wide receiver 44. Brian Thomas, my wide receiver 43, and I hate you, Dave. Well, there we go. Top 48 wide receivers. We went through 6 tiers. We're going to be back on Friday with our top 24 tight end rankings and tiers. I want to thank you guys, as always, for watching and listening all the way through. For myself, for Dave, we'll see you next time. Adios.